everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 15th of March, where we are putting some closure on Too Much Ado About Nothing, getting ready for our first formal paper, and also getting prepared to move into our next section, which happens to be Shakespearean histories. So in terms of Much Ado, I had talked about several quotes last class, and I wanted to end with just a few quotes that I didn't get a chance to cover. The first being Act 1, Scene 1, line 63. And basically at this point, Leonato is talking about how there is a skirmish of wit, a kind of merry war between Benedict and Beatrice. And I had indicated that while the men are returning from one war, they're really entering into another. What we see is a war of words, where words are used much like weapons. And in Act 1, Scene 1, line 160, this is where I was alluding to Claudio's concern about whether or not Benedict approved of Hero, that it was very important for Claudio not only that Hero be the only heir, but that also his friends, such as Benedict, approved of her. And the scene goes something like this, where Claudio asks Benedict, "Dost thou note the daughter of Signor Leonato?" And Benedict, in his sarcastic, facetious way, says, "I noted her not, but I looked on her." And Claudio says, "Is she not a modest young lady?" And Benedict says, "Do you question me as an honest man should do, by my simple true judgment? Or would you have me speak after my custom, as being a professed tyrant to their sex?" And Claudio says, "No, I pray thee speak in sober judgment." And Benedict says, "Why, in faith, methinks she's too low for a high praise, too brown for a fair praise, and too little for a great praise. Only this commendation I can afford her, that were she other than she is, she were unhandsome, and being no other but as she is, I do not like her." And of course, in all of this convoluted, jumbled language, basically he's saying that yes, he likes her and that she's attractive. And Claudio says, "Thou thinkest I'm in sport. I pray thee, tell me truly how thou likest her." And Benedict asks, as only Benedict can, "Would you buy her that you inquire after her?" And Claudio says, "Can the world buy such a jewel?" And Benedict says, "Yeah, and a case to put it into as well," which I believe one of you had indicated as one of your favorite quotes in the play. Of course, we know that Benedict, while he appears to not be susceptible to love, he is perhaps even more susceptible to love than Claudio ever could. The feelings that Benedict has for Beatrice seem to be much more based on their comparable intellects than on surface appearances, because Benedict and Hero represent a rather young and somewhat superficial love. That said, we know that that would not have necessarily been uncommon during Shakespeare's time, arranged marriages. And in fact, you would have noted at the beginning of the play, right before the costume or the masked ball, Leonato is very clear to his daughter that if Don Pedro were to offer his hand in marriage, to accept it. Of course, we know that Don Pedro is going to be wooing for Claudio rather than for himself, but obviously Don Pedro would be a very good catch. And now that the men have returned from war, the concern is about romantic relationships. And at one point, Don Pedro even asks Beatrice if she would be interested in him, and she lets him down easily. And basically, we know her heart belongs to Benedict. And we see the reality, perhaps, of love discussed by Shakespeare in Act 2, Scene 1, line 72, when he makes a reference to love being much like a dance. And he says, "Wooing, wedding, and repenting is as a Scottish jig, a measure in a syncopace. The first suit is hot and hasty, like a Scotch jig, and full as fantastical. The wedding, mannerly, modest, a measure, full of state and ancestry. And then comes repentance, and with his bad leg falls into the syncopace faster and faster, till he sink into his grave." And the last quote I wanted to leave you with is when Beatrice is trying to convince Benedict that he should kill Claudio. both for Beatrice's and Hero's honor. And Beatrice laments in Act 4, Scene 3, line 303, if only I were a man, that if I were a man, I would be able to take action myself. This is something that we saw earlier with with Midsummer Night's Dream, when Helena was talking about wooing and that women were not made to woo. So this is a topic that we oftentimes see in Shakespeare, commentary on gender, and about perhaps the unfairness associated with the restrictions placed upon the female gender. So we end up with a happy ending where the couples are together, though I know that can raise a few eyebrows with Hero and Claudio, especially because Hero forgives Claudio so easily. But again, that was considered to be the happy ending, and that they will probably develop more affection and trust as the years progress. Claudio is not killed, and this is how this play could have easily turned into a tragedy if Benedict, after he agreed with Beatrice that he would do that, he would kill Claudio. That's how serious he feels about that's how seriously he feels about Beatrice. But of course, this was all Much Ado About Nothing, and that means that finally Benedict will not have to take that kind of drastic action, because Claudio is going to be regretting what he's done to Hero, and in his own way apologizing. Though it always strikes me that he only feels remorse after it's been proven that Hero is faithful. And I wonder if Hero had not been proven to be faithful, would he have ever felt remorse? But the fact that he is willing to basically do what Leonato demands, no questions asked, that he will marry Leonato's niece without even seeing her ahead of time, is his way of showing that he is humbling himself to the family. And finally, of course, Hero's honor is restored so that we can have our happy ending. And the villain of the piece, we've got our Don John. He will be dealt with later after the play proper. Again, because you wouldn't want to end the play on a negative note. I also wanted to talk about the word nothing. And I wanted to do this last because nothing is in the title, Much Ado About Nothing. And obviously the entire play was Much Ado About Nothing. They were making a big deal out of something that was not real. You notice how much of this play is based on rumor and hearsay, and how much of this information is gotten through eavesdropping as well. But nothing being trivial. However, at the time, nothing in the original pronunciation would have been closer to noting. So there's some pun that's going on here with noting, in the sense that characters are noting or observing things about one another. But of course, as you already know, Shakespeare is going to take an opportunity to be bawdy if he can, because nothing or noting at the time was a euphemism for the female genitalia. And it is much ado about nothing, basically, Hero's genitalia, and whether or not she has been faithful to Claudio. So that gives you a general sense of Much Ado About Nothing. And I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about the histories, which we think that, at least according to scholars, Shakespeare would have written the histories in the earlier part of his career. And then later on, he would have written the histories. The histories were based on English history. So not just history, but English history. At the time, the probably history book of the day was the Chronicles of Holinshed. So Shakespeare took British history from the past, but he adapted it and he changed it to suit his own dramatic purposes. So sometimes it's useful to know the history, but sometimes it's very frustrating because Shakespeare will deviate from that for his dramatic purposes. They're known as chronicle plays, which means that all of the history plays can be read as individual units, but if you put them together, they tell a much longer story. And Shakespeare didn't necessarily write them in chronological order. It almost reminds me of movies with a good number of sequels. Take Star Wars, for instance, where we might be presented with the first play, but it's actually in the middle of the saga itself. And I wanted us to begin with the first play that starts the chronicle of British history, and that is Richard II, and he happened to be a king in medieval England. the history plays provided a great opportunity for patriotism and celebration of the country, but also was a wonderful way to make political commentary. If you remember, we had talked about that during Shakespeare's time. It was rather open in terms of sex and violence, but one had to be very cautious in terms of political commentary. And these were difficult days because the Queen Elizabeth, was at this point rather old, and she had no heirs. She was known as the Virgin Queen because she had never married, and of course that meant that she didn't have any heirs. So there were questions as to who would take the lineage upon her death. And of course, these were not questions that you would talk about openly because that could get you into a whole bunch of trouble. But if you could perhaps go into the past and find a historical episode that parallels what was happening during Shakespeare's time, well, then you can present that story from the past, and you can protect yourself by saying that you're not talking about the present. If there are any parallels with the present, it is merely coincidental. It's all basically past history that's been fictionalized. And that's how Shakespeare was able to make some of his most serious political commentary in the history plays, which are known to be very dark and oftentimes talk about death. And this is very different from what we've seen in the comedies. They are very complex because they've got lots of characters, but the good news is that most of those characters are minor characters that don't serve a whole lot of importance. You want to focus on the major characters, and we are going to be thrown into the world of political intrigue and all of the shifting alliances and hypocrisies and deceits that exist. I oftentimes said that in many ways these plays are an examination of what is happening and what does happen in Washington, D.C. So perhaps that might be in our own country. So perhaps that might be a way that you could approach the plays. If you're not particularly fond of politics, view this as an opportunity to kind of see what happens behind closed doors, because we see the political projection to the populace, and then we see what really is happening behind closed doors. So again, using a Washington parallel, we may not necessarily have access to the White House, but we can have access to Richard II and his kingdom, which is what we have here. And we had talked a little bit about the chain of being and the ranking that would go on for all living creatures. And the king would be considered, or the queen would be considered at the very, very top of the chain of being on earth. They were basically God anointed, and they were basically God's representation on earth, which meant that you needed to respect and obey the king, regardless if you agreed or disagreed with the king's policies, because the king was a representation of God. That said, what do you do if you've got a king who is corrupt and obviously corrupt, even though he is the representation of God? And that's the play Richard II, is that you're supposed to honor and respect the king, but Richard is not a good king. Richard is anything but a good king. And in fact, Richard would be based on British history, as I indicated, in medieval times. He was a boy king. So he became king when he was a boy, and what that basically meant is that the adults in court were running the kingdom until he became of age. And he was ultimately accused of abusing his power, as many times politicians are, and he was overthrown by someone named Bolingbroke. So that's the bare storyline of what we're seeing with King Richard. But again, it will be dramatized for us in Shakespearean in the Shakespearean play. And the play probably has some of the most famous Shakespeare speeches that you could find in any of the plays. So it's a play that's very rich in language. It's very lyrical. It's very poetic. And many times individuals have said that Richard really was a poet. He really wasn't a ruler. And I think you'll see that. And we will see that. As you know, we've been watching productions, and that's what we'll talk about next class, a production of Richard II. But I wanted to backtrack a little bit to writing papers, because your first paper is going to be due on the 31st of March, which is when we return from our spring break. Certainly you can hand in papers early, but certainly by March 31st, you want to try to get that first paper in. And as you know, at this point, we've got 2 comedies, and from the responses I've gotten and the attendance questions, it looks like most people are thinking about writing about the comedies. So I indicated a sonnet or sonnets are also possible, but those are very different sorts of exercises than writing about a play, because sonnets are short poems, so you want to keep that in consideration. Your paper's a critical paper, so you don't need to do outside research. What you're doing is you're interpreting and analyzing, in part because of my goal and hopes that at the ending of the semester, one of the things you've learned is how to navigate Renaissance language so that you can read plays on your own and other works on your own from this particular time period. And we, as you know, started the semester by talking about the dispute that exists even with scholars in terms of language. But we want to at least have some sort of a general sense of how to go about reading Renaissance English. And what I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about quotation, and that when we are quoting from Shakespearean plays, we can use a different format than what we would normally do if we were quoting from other texts. The MLA, Modern Language Association, is the association that's come up with the general rules of how to write a paper and also how to document or to quote your sources. And the importance of being able to document is that you want to be able to give the reader of your writing enough information of where you found your particular quotation so that they could verify the veracity of that particular quote. And not that they would, but you still want to be as ethical as possible. And usually what ends up happening, at least in the MLA, there's a different system for the APA, or the American Psychological Association, which is used for the sciences. But what we use for the humanities and for languages, which is MLA, is something called parenthetical documentation. That at the ending of the quote, whether the sentence is completed or not, but immediately following the quote, what we do is, in parentheses, indicate the least amount of information necessary for a reader to be able to find that particular quote. And usually the least amount of information necessary is something like a page number. That, of course, is predicated on the reader knowing what text you are referring to when you are citing a particular page number. So if it's not clear, then there are other things that you can put inside of those parentheses, such as the author's last name, for instance, or even part of the title of the text if you've got several quotations from the same author but different texts. And then at the ending of the paper, you have something called a works cited page, and that's a page that does list the works or the text that you've cited or quoted throughout your paper, and it gives all of the information of that particular text, the publisher, the date of publication, everything. And it's all listed once at the ending of the paper on the works cited page. And all of this information is alphabetized by author's last name, so that's how you find that information. And there are a strict set of guidelines for punctuating and formatting different sources, a book as opposed to a website, as opposed to a magazine article, so forth and so on. And that's usually how we go about quoting. But the good news with Shakespeare is that quoting is much more simplified because Shakespearean plays have been divided up into acts, scenes, and lines. And part of the beauty of that is that, as you know, for this particular class, you can use any version, basically, of Shakespeare. I recommend that you use a version that has some good footnotes because that will be of assistance to you. But regardless of whether or not you're using the book that I'm using or you're using a different book, we're not relying on page numbers. If we did, then that would be a little bit more problematic because my page numbers in my book could be different than the page numbers in your different book. But since things are divided into act, scene, and line, well, within the parentheses following the quote, we can list the act, the scene, and the line. And you can see in the notes below that I've written out some examples for how to go about quotation. This is under the section for writing papers and quotations. And you can see if you're just quoting a word, for instance, coward. Hamlet speaks of himself as a, quote, dull and muddy-mettled rascal. And then there's the comma and then the close quote because punctuation goes inside quotation marks. unless you're using parenthetical documentation. A coward, a villain, and an ass. And in that particular instance, just using the quotation marks themselves, that would be sufficient. But if you're giving a much longer quote, well, then you need to document. And you can see in the next example, Hamlet imagines the world as, quote, an unweeded garden / that grows to seed, close quote. And then in the parentheses, Act 1, you can see that's capitalized. Scene 2, you can see that's in lowercase. 135 through 36, and those are the line numbers. Notice how we shift to numerals for the line numbers. Close quotes, and then you put your ending punctuation, or you continue on with your sentence. The slash is how we indicate a break in the line of poetry. So that slash I read to you between garden and that does not appear in the original. That's something that would indicate to you that if you were reading the play, the line ends with the word garden, and then the next line begins, that grows to seed. And you can see something similar in the next example. Hamlet's conception of the world reveals itself early in the first soliloquy. And this is introduced by a colon. Quote, 'tis an unweeded garden / that grows to seed, close quote. And again in the parentheses, Act 1, Scene 2, 135 through line 136, close parentheses, end quotation. And then if we continue on, if you wanted to quote something longer, generally something over 3 lines, you would use the block quote formatting. And the block quote formatting is the formatting that you would use for basically duplicating what you see on the page rather. If you were doing a block quote for, let's say, a novel, then basically what you would do is you would indent in probably on both margins, approximately an inch or so. But here, what you're doing is you're just writing the line in its entirety, and then you're moving to the next line, and then the next line. And you can see that with Hamlet begins his first soliloquy with the wish for self-destruction, colon. And then you can see each line that basically would appear and the way it would read in the text itself. Oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. And then on the bottom of that is the parentheses with Act 1, Scene 2, line 129 to 32, close parentheses. Notice in a block quote, you do not use quotation marks because that's considered to be redundant. And in this instance, punctuation, if you're using a block quote, comes before, not after the parenthetical documentation. You can see another example here. Hamlet reflects upon the temptation to destroy himself as when he wonders. And then you can see that what we've got here is a long line of dots, which is basically indicating that several lines have been omitted. And that's based on the ellipsis. The ellipsis are 3 dots or 3 periods that can appear within a quote that basically indicate that a word or several words have been omitted by you, the writer, probably because they just are not necessary for the meaning for what it is you're trying to say. You're not deleting words to change meaning. That would be unethical. But you can see here that that long line of dots would indicate that we've got several lines that are skipped, which is indicated in the parentheses of Act 3, Scene 1, 69, comma, and then 74 through 75. So the first line is line 69, and then you can see that long line of dots, the long ellipsis, and then we can see that the following 2 lines are lines 74 through 75. And the next example is Hamlet again chastises himself in the soliloquy following the player's speech. And what we've got is after the after we have the player's speech, quote, oh, what a, and then we've got the ellipsis of just the 3 dots, meaning that a word or just several words have been omitted. Oh, what a, ellipsis, pleasant slave am I. And that's Act 2, Scene 2, 550. And again, we've got our closing quotes. And then if you were going to be quoting from a piece of prose, And, you know, verse is poetry, and Shakespeare writes in verse and poetry, but he also writes in prose, which we saw much of in Much Ado About Nothing. There's very much a play grounded in reality and prose. Well, then you would just go to the ending of the line and indent the way you normally would. So, for instance, world weariness overtakes Hamlet in his remarks to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And you can see here how we've got, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. And since it is just 3 lines long, we don't necessarily have to block it off. You can see we can incorporate it into the body of the text, and we go from one line to the other. And generally speaking, you should only use the ellipsis when you are omitting something from the middle of a passage. You get to decide where to start and end your quotation. Obviously, there's more language that appears before the point where you decide to start, just like there's more language that appears at the point which you decide to end. So you don't need to have an ellipsis at the beginning or the ending of a quote, because it's assumed that obviously there's language before and after the quote. But in between those 2 endpoints, your start and stop of the quote, if you're leaving out a word or several words, you use the ellipsis, the 3 dots. And if you ever wanted to insert yourself into a quote, not to give commentary, but to clarify something, oftentimes used with pronouns, words like he or she or it, where we're not necessarily sure who the he is referring to based on the quote that you've selected. Of course, in the whole, it would make sense that when you're saying he, you meant Benedict. But the quote that you selected, the he could be either Benedict or Claudio, and you're not certain. Based on the way that you've constructed that particular argument, you could insert yourself in the quote, and after the word he in square brackets, add your own language, such as Benedict. And that would clarify that the he means Benedict. And again, that's something that you do rarely, inserting yourself into a quote, but it's something that you might want to consider doing if you have a quote that perhaps sounds awkward. And again, you wouldn't need to do that at the start or the ending of the quote, because you get to decide where to begin and end. But if something in the middle is unclear, you can always insert in a square bracket. So for today's attendance question, now that we have completed 2 comedies, our attendance question will be due Tuesday, March 16th, 8 a.m. Which comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, did you prefer, and why? So, again, no right or wrong answer. I'm curious to hear, though, what your thoughts are. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will talk about Richard II and also talk a little bit more about papers. Take care. Bye-bye.